actually 2 years before the Paris Agreement, which, as you may recall, in 2015 was the first time that China really came to the table and actively participated and was ready to agree to a number of proposals to address the issues of climate change. And so that was 7 years ago now. It's 2015. The next conference was 2021. It was postponed by a year because of COVID, but the so-called Glasgow United Nations conference, which took place last November, was the first significant follow-up to the UN conference of 2015, the Paris Agreement. And we can talk a little bit more about the Glasgow Agreement. I think at the end of the day, from the point of view of achieving significant advances in addressing climate change, it was actually fairly disappointing. A number of major countries, the heads of states, didn't even attend. The head of state of Russia, China, Brazil, India, for example, didn't even attend the conference. But it was significant for one or two other things, which we might come back to later. Anyway, here we are in 2022. I think all of you will have read the news yesterday that the International Panel on Interagency Panel on Climate Change just introduced its most recent scientific report on the state of the world with regard to climate change. A very lengthy document, not very encouraging, clearly showing that we're not getting close to the targets that were set by the Paris Agreement in 2015. However, it does try to sound a note of optimism also, which is another thing that we can come back to. I should also add that what most people are going to be reading is the sort of summary, which is the part that was actually negotiated by the various governments. And if you've been following that closely, you'll notice that the details in the report are watered down with regard to a number of issues where it was hard to find agreement between the various countries. So that's just a really quick, that's 25 years now since the Kyoto Agreement, which we might see as a kind of scary thought. I mean, what have we achieved in 25 years? So that's something to contemplate as we proceed with this topic. I think what we'll do now is Alison, I'm going to ask Alison to show a 15, 16-minute video. This is actually put out by The Economist. And after we see it, we can talk a little bit about why I think that is significant. So, Alison.
I apologize because I got flustered when the computer shut down. I did not complete the overview that we were going to just sort of give you for the session. And so what I wanted to, if it will let me do it, why is it not letting me make the thing move? Oh, here we go. I just wanted to make sure that we went over a couple guidelines for how the session will go, which is, this is a discussion format. And so everybody's nicely put their names in. If there's a special way you'd like to be addressed, please write that in your name. We ask that if you have a question while people are talking, that you put it in the chat box. Alternatively, please use the raise hand function, the little down in the reactions section. You can select, I think I can show you right here, this little function right here, which raises your hand. That just makes it a lot easier for me to keep track of who is who in the queue. Keep your remarks brief. We want you to contribute. We want to hear your thoughts and opinions and insight, but we do ask that you keep your comments to around 2 minutes. And also These are topics that are supposed to be complex and sometimes contentious. We appreciate and welcome differences of opinion and different perspectives. We just ask people to be hard on ideas, but soft and kind with each other. When you're not speaking, please keep your microphone on. I also wanted to share, we are recording the session so we can have this available for educational purposes to share with people who miss the meetings. If you're not comfortable having your face recorded, you can turn off your camera. We're not sharing this for commercial purposes, obviously. And also, we just had a quick overview. Clifford, these are the questions that we're going to sort of go through today. Clifford started with the first one, how the conversation has evolved over the last 25 years, just so you have a picture of that. And I will go now to the video, which I have right up here. And now I have to share my screen again. Can you all see the video?
Yep.
Rising sea levels, desertification. Hollywood has always enjoyed imagining the end of the world. While blockbusters like this are clearly fiction, this film will show the scenario we all face, unless more drastic measures are taken to stop burning fossil fuels.
You might have seen videos like this before, but here's the big secret. Anyone can make one of these videos in a few minutes.
In some parts of the world, the effects of inaction are already clear. The slums of Bangladesh's capital are filling up with climate migrants. Minara comes from Bola district, an area in southern Bangladesh. There, like many other parts of the country, rivers swollen by heavier rain and melting Himalayan glaciers are washing away people's homes. Many, like her, have lost everything.
বলার বাড়ি তো জায়গা জমিনের শেষ ছিল না, অনেক জায়গা জমিন ছিল, অনেক ফসলের জমিন ছিল, বাড়ির জায়গা অনেক ছিল, বাড়িতে অনেক ফলমূল গাছ, বিভিন্ন ধরনের অনেক কিছু ছিল, সব কিছু নিজের গাছের জিনিস মানে খেতে পারতাম। এখন তো আর ওগুলা খাইতে পারে না, ওগুলো তো নাই। নদী 3 ভাঙা দেওয়ার পরে ঢাকা চলে আইতে হইছে। বাড়িতে থেকে তো অনেক আরাম ছিলাম, মানে খুবই খারাপ লাগতো, মানে সহ্য করার মতো না, ঘর দুয়ার ভাঙ্গা নিয়ে চলে যাওয়ার মতো টাইম ছিল না।
1.1 to 1.3 degrees of global warming has already transformed Minara's life. It's one of the reasons why so many migrants like her are moving to the city each year. Nearly 400,000, according to the last estimate. And climate models show there could be much worse to come. Climate scientist Yuri Rogel has spent the last 10 years modeling future climate scenarios for the United Nations.
The models we use to carry out this exercise really represent the state of the art of our current knowledge of climate change and where we are heading.
Yuri's projections use data collected by hundreds of scientists around the world.
Here, this is the 3-degree level, and so there is at least a 1 in 4 chance that under current policies we would hit 3 degrees by the end of the century.
This is just one of the scenarios Yuri looks at. Another one imagines that all policy promises are kept. The most optimistic assumes that all promises have been kept and net zero targets are met.
Where our best estimate ends up around 2 degrees at the end of the century, there is still a 1 in 20 chance that we end up with 3 degrees instead. One wouldn't be entering a plane if there is a 1 in 20 chance that the plane will crash.
A rise of 3 degrees would affect everyone. Even wealthy cities and rich countries wouldn't be immune to the consequences. European capitals like Paris and Berlin would bake under more extreme heat waves. Frequent storm surges in New York could turn parts of the city desolate.
In many ways,
cities magnify, intensify climate events. Cities are hotter than the places around them. They tend to be more vulnerable to flooding, and you can get a really bad event in a city in a way that you can't in the countryside. And because of their denser populations, disasters in a city affect far more people. Some cities might be badly prepared for the changes coming, but they have the means to adapt. Cities tend to be wealthier than surrounding places. They have a lot of amenities. A city that has taken seriously the risks of a 3-degree world wouldn't necessarily be a worse place to be in a 3-degree world. But a city that hasn't prepared for these sort of eventualities, that might be a really nasty place.
So far, many developed cities have gotten off lightly, but some rural parts of the world are suffering disproportionately. Smallholders, small-scale farmers, are particularly vulnerable to climate change, and there are over 600 million around the world. Smallholders with farms under 2 hectares produce around 1/3 of the global food supply. Central America's dry corridor supports a mix of smallholdings and medium-sized farms. Sandwiched between the Pacific Ocean and the Caribbean Sea, the area is prone to droughts. Israel Ramirez Rivera is a smallholder in Guatemala. Here, climate change is making the dry seasons longer and more severe.
Digamos que esta es la mazorca más grande que pudo dar esta parcela.
He depends on his crops of corn and beans, but they're getting harder to grow.
Las montañas a nuestros alrededores no nos tenían casi alimentos activos, cual ahora ya no hay, ¿verdad? Por el tema del cambio climático que viene afectando, ¿verdad?
Nearly 2/3 of the smallholders in the dry corridor now live in poverty.
El impacto que nos ha dado es de que a raíz de todo eso que ha venido a la desnutrición de los niños, se nos han muerto varios, a los cultivos más que todo, porque la canícula viene más a pegarnos más duros. Entonces ahí se nos marchita y ahí ya no hay tales de que vamos a producir un alimento en abastecimiento, ¿verdad?
Severe droughts in Central America are now 4 times more likely than they were last century.
Muchas familias de acá, pues, a unos han intentado emigrar en Estados Unidos, la desesperación económica, ¿verdad? Incluso aparte deudas, todo eso ha motivado de que los vecinos de esta localidad emprendan su viaje.
Migration from Guatemala to the United States has quadrupled since 1990.
If you're a woman over 40 and you want to lose belly fat, stop doing endless workouts.
Not all of this has been due to climate change, but longer droughts would force even more to move. In a 3-degree world, annual rainfall in this region could drop by up to 14%. At 3 degrees, over 1/4 of the world's population could endure extreme droughts for at least a month of the year. Northern Africa could see droughts that last for years at a time. But for some, too much water will be the problem. 10% of the world's population lives on a coastline that's less than 10 meters above sea level. For these coastal inhabitants, a 3-degree world would spell disaster. By 2100, global sea levels could have climbed by 0.5 meter from 2005 levels. Low-lying cities like Lagos would be especially vulnerable, with up to 1/3 of the population displaced. And in Fiji, rising waters are already upending lives.
You can see the graveyard there. It's all underwater now due to this rising sea level and climate change.
The village of Toguru in Fiji is being swallowed by the sea. Barney Dunn, the village headman, has seen over half the village disappear. Relatives' houses have been abandoned and family graves are now underwater.
We've been asked by the government to relocate, but no one wants to relocate because we have our great-great-grandparents down there in the sea. This is the place we've been brought up in. It's not easy to live.
Past attempts to build a seawall haven't worked, but Barney sees building a new one as the village's only hope.
If they do that, maybe we can save whatever is left. But if we don't have the seawall, then it will keep eroding, and time will come maybe in 10, 15 years, tomorrow will be all eroded.
Rising seas also mean storms cause more floods, and many more countries could suffer. The Philippines and Myanmar are just two countries that will also see an increase in storm surges in a 3-degree world. To escape, many will move, often to urban areas. Half the world's population already lives in cities, almost a third in slums. For them, a 3-degree world could be deadly. Minara has moved to Dhaka to escape the impact of climate change, but life could get even worse for her.
অনেক কষ্ট হইতেছে দিনে যখন রৌদ্র উঠে তখন অনেক কষ্ট আবার রাত্রেও অনেক গরম লাগে অনেক রাত্রেও ঘর ঠান্ডা হয় না তাপমাত্রাটা দিন দিন বাড়তে আছে মানে এখন কি আরো বাড়তেছে সামনের দিকে আরো বাড়বে এখনো থাকতে পারতেছি না সামনের দিকে কিভাবে থাকুন
Dhaka is getting hotter. In the last 20 years, the average daytime temperature has crept up by nearly half a degree. Days that approach 40 are now being reported. And high so-called wet bulb temperatures are on the rise. A wet bulb temperature is a measure of heat and humidity. Humans cool themselves by sweating. But in these conditions, when relative humidity is near 100%, sweat doesn't evaporate well. So people can't cool down, even if given unlimited shade and water.
At a high wet bulb temperature, the body can't lose heat, and so it gets hotter and hotter. And the body is designed to work at a given temperature. And if it gets too hot inside, you will die.
The human limit for wet bulb temperatures is 35 degrees Celsius, around skin temperature. Dhaka will have a much higher chance of reaching dangerous wet bulb temperatures if global warming reaches 3 degrees.
You can't really adapt to that. You have to get out. If the temperature is so high that you can't work, can't do hard manual labor outside for significant parts of the year, then many places will become functionally no longer part of the economy.
Jacobabad in Pakistan and Ras Al Khaimah in the United Arab Emirates have already recorded deadly wet bulb temperatures. More of the tropics and the Persian Gulf, as well as parts of Mexico and the southeastern United States, could all get to this threshold by the end of the century. Climate modeling might show us the weather, but it doesn't show us its other effects on society. Established migration patterns could change. Climate disasters may exacerbate reasons people cross borders. Within countries, more people will move to cities. In a 3-degree world, tens of millions of people a year could be displaced by disasters made worse by climate change.
When people are displaced by climate, they may well go to cities because cities are the places that attract people from the countryside already. A lot of people who can get to the developed world, not least because the developed world tends to be less hot, will give that a go.
As migration around the world increases, there could be more competition for fewer resources. Water, already a highly contested resource, will be a focal point. Turkey's new Ilısu Dam has reduced the flow of water into Iraq. China lays claim to rivers vital to India and Pakistan.
The prospect of a water conflict makes people very uneasy.
China, China!
How national tensions would exacerbate those sorts of reactions in a 3-degree world is the sort of thing that no one should really want to find out. I think you'd have to be incredibly sanguine not to think that the sort of climate extremes that we talk about in a 3-degree world wouldn't lead some places to the brink of societal collapse.
Those lucky enough to escape unrest would still have to adapt to a radically different world.
People can adapt to climate change in all sorts of ways. One of the most obvious ones is air conditioning. But other ways to adapt at a local or regional level, I mean, one of the most obvious is diversifying agriculture. There are physical things you can do, like seawalls. The fact that people can adapt and that adaptation will reduce suffering doesn't mean that it will eliminate suffering. Suffering is built into this whole process of heating up the planet.
Adaptation will be difficult so far.
The best way to deal with a 3-degree world is not to go to a 3-degree world. And that's why increasing efforts on mitigation are important. It's why with negative emissions that could bring down the temperature after it peaks are important. Once you get to a 3-degree world, you are in real bad global trouble.
The scale of change needed and the slow progress of governments so far means 3 degrees of warming is uncomfortably likely unless more is done. Despite existing pledges, greenhouse gas emissions are still set to rise by 16% from 2010 levels by 2030. The need to act has never been clearer. There's still time to reduce emissions so that a 3-degree world remains fiction rather than becoming fact.
Thanks for watching. To read The Economist's cover package on what a 3-degree world might look like, click on the link. And don't forget to subscribe.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about what we just saw. The reason that I showed this is it's first of all referenced in the Great Decisions chapter in the book on climate change. And the point is partly that, you know, this was produced by The Economist. This is not some radical magazine of the left. You may even say The Economist is a fairly conservative magazine, actually. But this is the point, that this is now something which is mainstream. It's not a radical idea. And so it introduces something that the article actually in the book talks about, which is the whole question of messaging. How do we actually more effectively talk about climate change in a way where you can engage people without getting into political fights, where you can actually have a constructive conversation? But let me put it out to you. The first question was, you know, how can we, you know, how has the conversation changed around climate change, or how can we change it more effectively? We saw that Al Gore, you know, tried, and that doesn't really get us very far, talking about, you know, the his terms he used. Even climate change today is still a kind of controversial term. So how do we better address this issue of how we talk about it? Any thoughts on that? I see Bob.
I recommend the movie Don't Look Up, if that's any help. It's not optimistic, but it's realistic.
I couldn't quite hear that, unfortunately.
The movie Don't Look Up, it's on Netflix. It's been getting a lot of press. It's very well done.
Okay.
It's a depiction of a parallel with a meteorite coming in to smash into Earth. And that's the parallel with climate change. And it's obviously, if you look at the movie in that context, you don't fail to understand what they're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other thoughts? Allison, do you see anybody? I can't see everybody on the screen, so I don't know.
Bill Hall.
I can't resist the opportunity to talk.
And
But-
then Susan Payne is after Bill
Yeah.
Hall. Yeah.
Okay.
So
Yep,
it's really interesting when you think about climate change and how do you present this issue. And there is a positive side to presenting the issue as well. So if you look at some of the changes that you might want to make that relate to reducing the threat to the Earth's climate, they can be very positive changes as well. For example, if you make a change in the emissions that you generate through, let's say, transportation, you can significantly reduce air pollution. And that makes everyone's lives much better, even if it's not, even if you say it's not directly related to climate change. So I keep wondering if there's, and I think it's out there, but maybe not emphasized enough, if there isn't a more positive way to spin this as well. So talk about the benefits that could be by the measures you take to prevent climate change. What are they going to benefit? How are they going to benefit society in many, many ways that even go beyond climate change? So a positive story to be told.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. And positive in one sense, although could be negative in another. I mean, I think that's one of the points that's being made in the article is that, this at the end of the day is a health crisis potentially for people everywhere. I know that the video concentrated on temperatures in places like Dhaka and Bangladesh, but from what I'm hearing, even now in places like Arizona, people don't want to go outside in the summer because it feels so hot and so unhealthy. So to talk about the effects of climate change in terms of how it actually affects people's health, how it affects pollution, access to clean water, I think that's exactly the kind of point that's really important. So who was else? Susan? Was
it? Susan Payne, then Jim and Janet, and then Bill Franks.
Yeah, hi, thanks. I think that there's a center at Yale that looks at communicating about climate change, and they do regular polls of the American population, and they have found increasing acceptance of the idea that the climate is changing and we need to do something about it in all political groups. The Democrats are higher proportion than Republicans, but all groups are accepting that this is a real problem. I think that it's important to emphasize what's going on at the local level and not just in faraway countries. And I've been surprised when I've talked to people who've lived in Maine longer than I have. I've lived here 20 years, and they have seen real changes, and they're concerned about how this is affecting us here. I mean, you even talk about the loss of the winter ski season and the tourism people are worried about. So I think that's one thing to talk about what people are seeing in their own lives and what they're worried about. And I also think that, I mean, to get back to this idea of how people feel, there's sort of a increasing problem of doomism. People say, well, it's already so bad, it's locked in, there's nothing we can do. And Michael Mann has written an article with one of our local people, Peter Dugas, talking about how if we really did something, we could make a change in probably within 5 years in carbon in the world. I mean, we can't give in to this doomism, which is increasingly sort of giving people an excuse for not doing anything. And so I talk to people about active hope. If you're feeling doom, like things are hopeless, get involved in some kind of a local group. And also don't focus on just changing your own personal behavior, because that is not a solution to the problem. We need systemic changes. We need a price on carbon. We need the politicians to know that we care about this. So that's it's more than 2 cents probably.
Okay, thank you, Susan. That's very good.
I should say,
very helpful.
I'm a member of the Citizens Climate Lobby, and we're actively focusing on all these issues.
Right. Okay.
Thank you, Susan. Jim and Janet are up next.
Yeah, this is Janet. Susan talked about the local level and also the systemic level, but I do want to talk about the personal level to address the question of how do you get to some people. I've got a lot of family in South Carolina, very conservative, very right-wing. And one of my nephews is involved in a company that does solar panels. Well, he sells it in South Carolina because of the economic savings that people will get from putting the solar panels up. Nothing about climate change. Here's the money you're going to get back. And I heard the same kind of theory from a nephew-in-law who has either a hybrid car or electric, plug-in electric or something. And he said, I didn't buy this for climate. It's not going to make any difference to climate. And then there's actually some truth to that at this point because of the other issues with that. But does I do it for the cost savings? I don't have to put gas in my tank. So when we think about how to make an impact on a personal level, I think those are things that seem to be working with conservative people in the South.
Good, thank you.
All right, Bill Franks. Oh, Bill, you're still muted. You got to hit that dumb unmute button. There you go, Bill.
Okay, well, I find the last person's comment very interesting because we run into the same kind of issue here in Wells. I'm on the Wells Energy Committee, which we wanted to morph into a Wells Sustainability Committee, and the Select Board shot us down. And on the Energy Committee, the only way we can sell our projects is if they save money. If they help the climate, and they always help the climate, but it's impossible to sell something on purely the argument that you're going to help the climate. And I find that extremely ironic and a little bit discouraging because something like 90% of the tax base in the town is east of Route 95. And if you know Wells, that's not a very large place. And with sea level rise, it's going to be very dramatically altered. So I must say, I'm a strong proponent of measures, but very discouraged at the attitude of our local leaders.
Thank you, Bill. Yeah, there's another, well, so that the point that was also made, this whole idea of how you have to find something positive in the situation, that you have to sort of not despair. That's not going to get anybody anywhere. We have to find some positive to talk about. I think that's important. The other, I did send, I don't know how many of you had a chance to read it. There was an article that I was sent out, I think, with your registration, which is entitled, there's a messaging battle right now over America's energy future. That was more of a focus on how people in the petroleum industry talk about this issue with people who are green advocates. The idea that if now people can talk about energy transition as a more kind of neutral, if you like, term, which is something that people can actually at least have a conversation about. They may not all agree about what that means, but at least it's something that they can talk about constructively. That was the point that was being made in the article, I think. So that's another aspect of this, which again is this question of how can we find words to use or that find common ground where we can actually make some progress in talking about the issue. Any other comments on this aspect of messaging? Oh, I see.
Karen and John Saucier.
Here we go. Sorry, I can't find my little hand icon. Sorry. And we were eating dinner before, so now you got us in live. But anyhow, no, my comment is, I keep thinking that if there were little suggestions on the internet or in the newspaper every day about little things that individuals can do, because I think so many people say, well, it's just such a big problem. There's nothing I can do. But I just, from not buying water bottles, I mean, that's my claim to fame, is I refuse to buy water in a bottle. But, and I don't know if you could equate that with some well, how much it saves, or if everybody did it. I mean, yes, there are the things at the airport now where if you fill your bottle up there, it tells you how many bottles you're saving. But I just think so many people feel that there's nothing they can do. And that's why I wish the messaging would get to, this is what you can do, this little step. Yes, you can, obviously people know you can buy a Tesla or you can buy, different cars, but more for the common man, just what people could do. If that was more publicized, I don't know, I would like to think it might help.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we should move on a little bit. So we got a lot of other things to talk about. But I did want to link to that. Allison, I think the second question maybe is related to this, which is, why is climate change more of a political than a scientific issue?
Yeah. Why is climate change more of a political issue than a scientific issue? Clifford, why is climate change more of a political issue than a scientific issue?
Well, that's
or should we ask the audience?
Yeah, I mean, is it what is it about human nature? Perhaps that's one way of suggesting an answer to this, that we can't sort of sometimes deal with this or deal with it in a sort of rational manner. Why has it become something that's not supposed to be political? Why has it become so political? Any thoughts?
I see Owen's hand up, so I'll give Owen the floor, then Jim and Janet, and back to Bill Hall after that. Owen?
Hi, can you hear me? Great. Yes, I was thinking about something I read years and years ago about the tragedy of the commons, that philosophical idea that ultimately things like this are not going to be soluble because it's not in anybody's interest to be kind to their neighbor, as it were. And when we were talking about what we can do locally, I was just looking at the figures that very nearly 40% of the world's CO2 emissions are from China. Now, if you're looking at China's economic progress, and then take a step back and think about all the countries that haven't achieved even what China has done, we're basically saying to them, no, you can't do what we've done. And I think that's why it is a huge political issue, because we're basically telling everybody, sorry, you've got to stop your development because it's bad for the world. Now, if you're in the developing world, how are you likely to react to that?
Yeah. And India, of course, is another good example.
Jim and Janet, do you want to answer Owen or you want to answer Clifford?
I'm going to answer the main question again, going back to some personal experience here with my family. Bottom line, I think why it became political was that the right, maybe others, worried about obviously coal mining jobs and other kinds of jobs that would go away, and what the impact would be on the economy, not realizing that we could have better job growth with the sustainability stuff that's happening now. And talking to my sister, who's a real climate denier and has been for years and years, all she would need was one scientist that didn't agree with climate change, and she thought she had all the evidence that she needed. Even when her pastor finally came around to climate change and believing in it, she still didn't budge. But I was so proud of him. He went public. He was, I don't know if y'all remember, about maybe 10 years ago, a bunch of pastors came out for climate change. My sister would also complain that she heard that researchers who did articles on, not believing in the climate change with data opposite of what the climate change people were publishing, that they weren't allowed to get their research published because there was too much of a lock on it by the people who believed in the climate change. So they were blaming the publications for not accepting those publications. So that's just some of the stuff I heard from her.
There's certainly There's
Thank
certainly a
you.
fair amount of that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bill Hall?
When I think about the political aspect of this, one of the reasons obviously is sort of following up from what Janet was saying too, is follow the money. And it is really difficult when you're talking about a government, typically government-led initiative, which is going to have a negative impact on a gigantic petrochemical industry. This is just huge. It's huge in the United States because we're one of the leading producers of petrochemicals, and also huge in countries like Russia, for example. So it's highly political when you threaten people's livelihoods.
Good point.
I think
Also, yeah, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, some of the other things I jotted down was, climate change, we talk about it, but it's sort of abstract in the sense that it's not something that you can easily observe in your day-to-day life. I mean, you can certainly, go down to the beach on a particularly high tide day and see how the water has come up more than it used to or something like that. But basically, it's not something that's immediately observable. Also, it's not immediate for most of us in the sense that it's not something that happened yesterday or will happen tomorrow. So I wonder if that isn't also an aspect of it that affects us in terms of how we, and then look at what happened on the other hand. What are people most worked up about right now? The higher price of gasoline. Right? That is the big issue. That's something that's very observable, that immediately impacts people on a daily basis. And that's what they're going to react to. Does that make sense? I see nodding heads.
It makes a lot of sense, Clifford. It's depressing, but it's true. Jim and Janet, did you have another comment?
I want to take exception to the thing about not being immediately observable.
Okay.
If you're a Nordic skier,
yeah,
winters are a month shorter than they were when I moved to Maine in 1981. So, we have 4 less weeks of skiing.
Yep.
And we have to travel to mid New Hampshire under the Mount Washington snow bowl to find the snow.
That's right. And it's pretty hard to cross-country ski anywhere around Portland anymore.
Yep. Susan Payne, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, right. I would just like to build on what Bill Hall said about the threatening oil jobs, because we know from research that people at Harvard have done that the oil industry aggressively sowed doubt in people's minds, similar to the way the tobacco industry did, to make them feel that climate change was not real. So there's been active lobbying and use of money to change people's opinions. And I also think that as human beings, we're primed to see things that are right in front of us that are immediately threatening, and the idea that we have to change something and give something up that is dear to us, like our cars, for the benefit of someone far away or in the future is hard for us to understand. But I would just say, as a grandparent, I think that that's changed. Having grandchildren has changed my whole time perspective, and I think that the grandparents and the children are a real force for possible change, because it does change your ideas about what's important in future generations.
Okay.
Bill Hall?
I love Susan's comment because I find that tremendously positive. I just thought that was terrific because I was thinking the same thing. If I think about my kids or grandkids, they really do have a different take on this. And I think that's a very good thing. And following up on Jim's comment too, I heard a great story from Aspen, Colorado a couple of days ago on the radio. And the folks at Aspen were saying our ski season is now 1 month shorter than it was just 20 years ago.
Yep.
And they're thinking, well, what's going to happen to this grand skiing enterprise we've created here in Colorado? And in a way, that's kind of the opposite of folks who are defending their right to, say, pump oil because it brings them money. Here you've got an industry that's dependent on a certain type of climate that may be going away. They may have a little more interest in seeing how we can fight climate change. So I felt sorry for Aspen, Colorado, at least just briefly.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
I think it's interesting. I mean, you know, growing up in Maine, and coming back after 20 years where I was living for part of those 20 years, of course, I was living in Amman, Jordan in the Middle East. And so I've sort of spent most of my time in two places that are sort of on the front lines of climate change, because the Gulf of Maine obviously is one of the fastest eating bodies of water. And then the sort of Jordan Rift Valley is where you see it on the other extreme, and kind of going back and forth and seeing the dramatic changes. If you think about in Jordan, the dry season, it's almost like the climate cycle is sort of contracting in a strange way, where you used to have, you know, so many weeks of so rains are for a shorter period, but they're coming later. And then the hotter season is longer and coming earlier. And the evaporation of water, of course, watching the Dead Sea disappear over time, and then coming back here. And I mean, I grew up skiing on the Yarmouth ski team, and we would practice in somebody's cow farm right here off of North Road in Yarmouth. And I don't think that place has been covered with snow once this entire season. And the other thing I notice is the absence of birch trees. Birch trees are disappearing, which of course is climate. But Clifford, I think I want to go back to Owen's point, which I think leads us nicely into the next question that you wanted to talk about, which is the intersection of climate and climate change and geopolitics. Because I mean, Owen was raising this very important point about how do we tell India, how do we tell China, how do we tell these countries, you know, sorry.
Right, right.
Right.
Yeah. Well, let me just pick up on that then. I mean, that of course has been a major bone of contention in all of these United Nations international meetings since they started. And actually, initially, for example, China essentially refused to even discuss or contemplate the idea that they should expect to bear any kind of financial responsibility for dealing with climate change. This was essentially all the fault of the Western industrialized powers, which is in a sense correct. But now China accounts for something like more than 20 or 25% of the world's total CO2 emissions. So their own rapid economic development has changed that equation dramatically. And I referenced earlier, of course, what was it called? The apocalypse, the air apocalypse that they experienced in 2013, which really shifted their thinking significantly. But it still remains a bone of contention, even if you look at the latest IPCC report and the discussions that came out of the Glasgow conference last year. The lesser developed countries, which are much less responsible for the emissions problem, continue to press for more financial support and compensation, if you like, from the developed countries. And they continue to be dissatisfied with the poor response that they're getting. So this continues to be a major issue. I mean, Dhaka, which was featured in the video, in Bangladesh is a country with a population now of over 100 million people. But most of them really very, very poor people. I mean, a very high poverty rate. So they really don't have the resources to begin to deal with this problem themselves. So moving from that to, that is one of the big geopolitical issues. The video, of course, also featured the issue of climate migration, which is not only internal, as it was talked about in the case of Bangladesh, but of course is also international. It intrigues me that one of the first agencies within the United States to raise the alarm about climate change as a national security issue was actually our military complex. The Pentagon has been trying to sound the alarm about the national security implications of climate change for several years now. And it puzzles me why the Republican Party in this country does not, for example, seem to really respond to that. So that's another interesting question. Then we have, most recently, since this chapter was written, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has elevated the whole concern about energy security. And it is interesting to observe that most of the petroleum production in the world now is in states that are ruled by totalitarian regimes, not only Russia, but also Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, other parts of the Middle East. Those are the countries that are responsible for most of the world's oil production. And so in the US, we've reached the fortunate position where we're somewhat more independent of other countries' oil production, but not the case in Europe or Japan, for example. And so what we've seen with the situation with Russia is that this has elevated the whole issue of how the rest of Europe is going to generate the necessary energy for its economy. And of course, it's particularly alarming for Germany, because Germany is the one country in Western Europe which is the most dependent on Russian fossil fuels. Partly, it has to be said, because half of Germany was at one time East Germany. And if you look at the infrastructure for fossil fuels in East Germany, of course, it was tied into the infrastructure in the Soviet Union. So that's an inherited problem. But the Germans in particular are now really sound kind of desperate about what they're going to do in this situation. And the last geopolitical issue, which I wanted to mention, which has also raised its head, is in this era where we seem to be pulling back from globalization, access to important minerals is now becoming an issue. So, for example, China has been working very hard to basically monopolize some of the key minerals that are required for energy transition. Lithium is one example, of course, but there are many others. And so that's where we now have President Biden talking about wanting to use mechanisms to promote industrial policy, which would guarantee security for certain kinds of minerals in the United States, which right now is dependent on China and other parts of the world. So maybe I should go back to Owen. Owen, is that, do you have another response to that or thought on that?
Owen, are you there? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, can't use the camera right now, but well, you've covered the geopolitical angles well, I think, Clifford. The problems that you mentioned a few minutes ago at the various conferences do, I think, largely stem from the question of why should the developing world give up progress for the sake of something 75 years down the road. I can't see the solution to that. I can't see China really signing up to reducing its energy consumption to the extent that it would reduce carbon emissions. As I say, they're at nearly 40% of global carbon emissions. It would potentially wreck their future. They've already got demographic problems, of course, we know that, but their economy relies on huge amounts of energy in all sorts of industries. I just do not see them doing it. And then, as is being said in the UK, which has done relatively well in terms of reducing its carbon emissions, it's 1% of global emissions, and that's a pretty large economy. So I fear here that we're actually up against a problem that may not provide a solution. But I don't like to be pessimistic, so I'll leave it to the rest of you to sound more optimistic.
Yeah, thank you. What about this question of the situation in Europe with Russian energy supplies? There's two points of view that have been presented. One is that the fossil fuel companies are rubbing their hands with glee because this is now going to strengthen the argument for increased production of oil and natural gas, particularly. On the other side, you have people who said, no, this will actually result in a more determined effort by the Western European countries to shift to renewable energy. What do you think is the most likely scenario, or is it a mix of both? I see a couple of several hands. Who's first, Allison?
Hang on. Bob Ashton had his hand up a while ago. So we'll say Bob, then Susan, then back to Owen, and then Bill.
One of the factors I'm afraid we have to consider is that we are going to need more and more energy. We would love to get it all from renewables, but it's going to take massive investments and a fair amount of time to accomplish that. In the meantime, somebody's going to have to get energy from somewhere, and I'm afraid the only answer is carbon-based in the meantime. And the greenies are going to shriek and holler and say, why don't you build more wind vanes? Well, okay, but it takes 10, 20 years to do that. And I'm afraid that's part of the picture that we have to contend with. Sorry.
Okay, that's one point of view. Anyone else? Who's next?
It's Susan, then Owen, then Bill.
Yeah, right. I don't have the facts in front of me, but I think when we're talking about China's carbon emissions compared to ours, we have to think about it on a per capita basis, per person basis, because countries like the UK and United States and Canada are very high in emissions per person, whereas countries like China are very low. So it gives kind of a false impression of China's dominance if we don't think about that. And also, I've seen documentaries about the renewable energy in China, and it's just staggering, the size of the battery farms and the solar farms and the windmills. And it's also in the United States now, it's cheaper for new energy facility to go to renewable than to build a fossil fuel based industry. So while I take account of everything people have said about the obstacles, I think that it's not quite as dire as people have been saying. I think I still get back to the point, we need the political will to say we need a sustainable environment for our generation and for our children and our grandchildren, and let's figure out how to make it happen.
Mm-hmm. And just to respond to that, I mean, Susan, you're absolutely right that I mean, China is actually the leader in the production of electric vehicles in the world. And that's why they want all to control the supply of lithium and all these other valuable things. And the same thing happened with solar panels. If you remember that the price came down because the Chinese became the dominant producer of solar panels in the market. And they were the ones who were able to drive the price down. So you're right. Yeah.
So Owen is next, but I also wanted to put in the chat, before the pandemic, the World Affairs Council of Maine's last pre-pandemic in-person meeting at the Wishcamper Center was with Barbara Finnemore, who wrote a book, Will China Save the Planet? And she worked with, exactly. And it's a very interesting analysis, because she pointed out a lot of the systemic and endemic reasons that coal production was dangerous for the Communist Party, in the sense that there was a lot of public anger about the pollution and these kinds of things. It was a very nuanced and interesting analysis. The other thing I think she pointed out was one of the advantages of authoritarianism is that if, in an authoritarian country, if you decide there will be windmills, there will be windmills. If you decide that there will be solar panels, there will be solar panels. And that, in a democracy is something that we have to quibble about. So, but Owen, I'm talking on top of you. Let me hand the back to you.
Just one thing, Allison, to add to that. I mean, on the other side in China, most of the coal production is actually managed at the local province level. And even in China, with its authoritarian rule, they have trouble keeping those provinces in line.
Owen, go ahead.
Taking Susan's point, you're absolutely right. Per capita does make a big difference to emissions. Mind you, actually, China's per capita emission is still higher by about 40% than that in the UK. You could argue, well, that's because there's so much heavy industry in China and there's much less in the UK than there used to be. Perfectly true. A lot of people in the UK say we've actually exported our emissions to countries like China because that's where the industry is now. Nonetheless, that doesn't really provide a solution. If we're saying now that the world will no longer progress in the direction of industrial development, who is actually backing that up? Because if you're talking about individuals giving up things, we would have to change our way of life. If, for example, if China is not going to produce what it's producing at the moment, what are we going to buy? It has massive implications. And I think, to put it briefly, I mean, this is why these conferences, as Clifford said right at the outset, have tended to be very disappointing. Everyone comes with high expectations, and what comes out of them is very often a damp squib. And Glasgow was an example of that too. I mean, our minister at the end giving his speech was actually in tears because he'd been unable to achieve what he thought was achievable. That's a serious politician at a reasonably high level ending up crying. I think that underlines the magnitude of what we're facing. As for Europe, just briefly, I think because of Ukraine, people are no longer concerned in Europe about giving up oil. They're worried about where they can buy it. And that goes for gas as well. So the topic has changed totally in Europe because of Ukraine, not to anybody's benefit, even the oil companies, I would say.
So Bill Hall and then Bill Franks.
So I want to accuse Owen of tearing apart this moment of glory that I had and joy from Susan Payne's comments. And I really feel bad now. I'm counting on my kids and grandkids to save the planet. So Owen, I've got to work toward that end. But anyway, I thought your comment was really interesting because it does bring home how incredibly difficult this whole issue is. But Ukraine is having an interesting effect on all this, obviously. And one of the effects is, I think, other than just these countries looking for where else can I find gas and oil, I think they're giving more serious thought to how else can I produce energy that is not reliant on petrochemicals. So I think that that may be one of the outcomes of the Ukraine. Now, again, this is as you said, it's a terribly long process. So will it happen? I don't know. If it does, it's going to take a long time. And your comment too, Clifford, about the military warning about climate change as a national security issue. And why haven't the Republicans paid, why haven't they latched onto that? Some have, but it's interesting. Their view is interesting. I've heard several Republicans say, well, climate change is happening. We have the evidence that it's actually happening. So they're not denying it. But what they're saying is it doesn't have anything to do with our warming the planet. It's a natural process. It's happened before. All we can do is mitigate. And mitigate means we can deal with the symptoms. We can't deal with the causes, which is certainly an interesting and I think dead end approach to climate change. And the other thing I would say is I appreciate the plug for my talk, which I'll be doing in a couple of weeks, 3 weeks or so, on industrial policy. And I'll try to weave in what I've learned tonight.
Right. So yeah, you're actually exactly right, Bill. Mitigation is the theme of many Republican leaders. That is the official policy of DeSantis in Florida now.
Bill Franks, then Bob Ashton, and then back to Owen.
Okay, well, I saw that somebody had said nuclear in the chat thing, and that was the point I wanted to make, is that nobody has mentioned it up to now in this context, and I think nuclear power will have an important role to play. And if you think back, and if anybody watched the discussion between President Duda and President Biden on his visit to Poland, President Duda raised several times the fact that he wanted support for nuclear power stations in Poland to replace Russian gas.
Yeah.
So and if you look back at history, as a result of the oil crisis, the French went nuclear. And so if you look at the I have my peanut gallery here.
That's me. Sorry.
If you look at the dependence on gas of France versus Germany, France, because it has a very vigorous nuclear power program, is much less dependent upon gas. So.
And Germany did what Germany did.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I'm done.
Why are you?
Right. So thanks.
Bob Ashton, I think is next.
Sorry,
Bob?
me again. Two things. Germany was going heavily nuclear, and then they shut it down because they were concerned about it. Don't they regret that now?
Right.
The other question I would want to point out, how many of us are willing to give up flying to go down and see Aunt Matilda in Florida, or your children in California or something? Are you willing to give that up? I simply leave the question open, but I will shut up.
Bob, you're behaving yourself very nicely this evening.
Allison, we have just about
Owen,
short time left, so I don't know if we should.
Well, listen, who did I say? I said Owen, and then I think Susan are the last two hands. So if we can go quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, very quickly. Congratulations to Jim and Janet for raising nuclear, because that's what I was going to raise too. Absolutely right, as far as the distinction between Germany and France is concerned. Britain's problem is that it doesn't have the technology to build the stations anymore. It needs China for that. That's become a real difficult political issue. So nuclear looks as if it will eventually become part of the solution, I think. But just think how long it takes to build a nuclear power station. I mean, even in an authoritarian regime, it will take 10 years. In West Europe, it's more like 20. So yeah, we've got to bring nuclear back into the mix, but that's longer term.
Susan, quickly.
Yeah, very quickly. I have a very quick point and a little bit longer point. In terms of the flying, I have read analyses that say that individuals who fly once or twice a month, we're not the problem in terms of airline emissions. It's all the private jets and the people jetting around, to weekends and stuff. So we don't have to think about giving up trips to see Aunt Matilda in Florida. And just on the longer, more broad position, if you think about people's attitudes toward climate change, some people accept that it's happening and we need to do something. Some people are skeptical, or they could be convinced, or they're movable. Other people are deniers, and then they won't change their minds no matter what. So to go back to our first question about communicating, I think that if we care about this and we focus on reaching out to the people who are skeptical and talking to them about the kinds of things we've been talking about tonight, we have a chance to maybe bring about more acceptance of this as something we need to work on, and not to worry so much about the people who are complete deniers.
Okay, shall we move on to our next topic, which I think, Allison, was how do we finance this whole energy transition?
Yes, follow the money to the future, I think.
Yeah,
where do we find the financial resources to it? But follow the money in the positive way. Where do we get the financial resources to address climate change? And I think one part of this is that some of the financial resources actually present themselves with the economic opportunities.
Right.
Right.
I just wanted to say, first of all, I mean, I totally agree with the people who've talked about nuclear, that I mean, France produces 70% of its energy needs from nuclear. They've never had an accident. I mean, there's new kinds of nuclear, more cost-effective nuclear plants now coming to market. It's very, and you know, Elon Musk, who I have to say I'm a bit of a fan of, he said it was ridiculous that the Germans were going to close down their nuclear plants. So there you are. But yeah, follow the money. It's kind of a theme that I like to follow. I did want to first of all say, going back to the Glasgow UN conference on climate change, that Mark, I don't know if you heard the name Mark Carney. Mark Carney is the former head of the Bank of England, and before that, the Bank of Canada. And he was appointed as the UN Special Advisor on Climate Change. And one of the things that took place at the Glasgow meeting, which didn't get a lot of publicity, was that he brought in the heads of some of the major banks from the rest of the world, a pretty large collection of senior bank officials. And he worked with them to create something that's called the Financial Alliance for Net Zero. The Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And they pledged several $1 trillion. I mean, this is like serious money. While we may be suspicious of some of the people in the banking world, this is actually a very interesting initiative to me. And that's something that will be interesting because, you know, we're talking here about major investments. But what we're actually seeing at the same time is a huge shift in the allocation of capital. I mean, the reason that, as far as I can have read it, that the oil companies are not really keen to increase their production, which Biden is pressing them to do, is because the financial risk of investing very large sums of money in fossil fuels is now considerably more than what it used to be. And a lot of the smaller oil companies already went bankrupt when prices collapsed. The bigger companies would prefer to operate with their existing resources, pay dividends to their shareholders to keep them happy, and not take some of the financial risks that would be involved in exploration. I would personally bet, I wonder if anybody would take me on this, that we have seen the end of drilling in Alaska, for example. One of the last things that Trump tried to do was to sell gas leases in Alaska, and he didn't get a single serious bidder. I don't think the banks in Canada have already said they will refuse to continue financing the what do they call that oil, the heavy oil that comes from Calgary.
Tar sands.
Tar sands. Thank you. Thank you. So I think there are some real questions about that. On the other hand, so you have a lot of people divesting from fossil fuel companies. You have other movements to get people who oppose fossil oils on. Exxon had to accept 2 new board members who were there precisely because they're pushing back on Exxon's policies. So, there's a long list of things that one could go on about. I mean, Tesla is, of course, an amazing example. The valuation of Tesla now is far exceeds the combined value of General Motors and Ford. Well, why is that? I think we can draw our own conclusions. Since we don't have a lot of time, I think I won't say too much, but I think that one of the positive things for me is to look at the shift in investment into the renewable energy field. But let me open that up a little bit if anybody else has any thoughts on that. I also wonder, by the way, whether we exaggerate the role for government intervention, at least in a country like the United States, where we are clearly wedded to free enterprise. The comment, by the way, at the end of that article that I circulated was from Obama's, John Podesta, I think it was. And he said that, here we go, let me quote this. The transition to clean oil, to clean energy, that the transition will leave fossil fuels behind. He said that he personally would bet, if we let the marketplace decide, I'm going to make my bet on renewables plus storage. So, vote with your money. Okay. Any thoughts on where is the money going to come from for this major transition?
Yeah, we already have the regional greenhouse gas initiative money coming into states like Maine. It's New England. It's a tax. I'm not quite sure what is taxed, if it's electric production, but that's where our Efficiency Maine money comes from in the state for helping people put clean energy into our homes and our businesses. So that's one way of doing it. Another way would be to institute a federal fee on carbon, and that can either be used, the money that could come in could either be used to pay for renewable energy, or it could just be sent back to people. And that's what Citizens Climate Lobby has been working with people in the Congress on, a carbon fee and dividend that would be returned. And many other countries have these already, and they're implementing tariffs on our goods because we don't have them. So there are a lot of reasons for us to think seriously about this.
Thank you. Just wanted to give one more example. I used to live down in the Washington, D.C. area when I was at the World Bank, and my local utility was Virginia Power, which is a part of a company called Dominion Resources. So I still actually own some stock in it, and I follow it. Virginia Power just decided to sell off all of its assets in pipelines, partly because it's so difficult now to even get approval for a new pipeline. and they're investing in wind energy, and they now have the largest proposal for offshore wind of any company in the United States. It's going to cost something like $9 billion to put this together. But I'm just using that as one more example of a shift in investment.
Yeah.
So Clifford, I think we can let Owen have one comment, and then I think we're going to have to wrap up because it's 8:29.
Okay, well, if we can go over, I want to ask people if they have any encouraging thoughts to end with. Go ahead, Owen.
I'm not great on encouragement for this, but one good thing that came out of Glasgow was there was agreement on how much money would be supplied to developing countries for adaptation. And there we're talking $40 billion a year, which is not an inconsiderable sum. So I just end on the positive note that actually that did at least come out of Glasgow in November.
Mm-hmm.
I think Bill Hall wants to say something positive.
Since Owen went to a positive note, I have to say that was great. I will add to his positive note just by saying that we're here in a Zoom meeting. So we didn't have to go anywhere. We didn't have to drive anywhere. We didn't have to pump more stuff into the atmosphere in order to have this very interesting class. And I really enjoyed it, and I enjoyed all the comments that I heard. And Clifford, thanks for putting it together.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Any other final thoughts of optimism?
Only positive ones.
I see more solar panels. When I drive up to Sugarloaf, no matter which way I go, I see more solar panels, solar farms in Waterville, though, those two big solar farms. So that's positive. Well, Clifford, thank you very much for all the effort that you put into this. And I want to, these sessions depend, this is really a membership initiative. It depends on the members who come forward to facilitate these sessions and to share their expertise. And we're really lucky. Next week, same time, same channel, we have Lila Bisharat, who's going to talk with us about demographic change. Then Bill Hall will share his thoughts on industrial policy. April 26th, we have Andrea Stanley Hester, who is going to talk about Russia in the US. Small, boring, not interesting topic right now. Then we have May 3rd, but Brad Babson's going to talk about the crisis in Myanmar within the context of ASEAN. Then, this is really a novel topic, but I'm really excited about it because foreign policy is changing and foreign policy is having to address issues that I don't think we ever thought of. So cybersecurity, all of climate, but also outer space. What's the Space Force? How do we regulate? Do we regulate it like the oceans? All of these really interesting questions. And then we'll wrap the series off on May 17th with Ambassador Judith Fergan and the Quad Alliance. And so thank you all for supporting this and for being here this evening. And I will see you all next week. Okay, good night, everyone. And thank you again, Clifford.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Have a nice evening, everybody. And the recording will be available. Thank you.